Welcome to the last week of the Civic Engagement Online class. I know we packed a ton into this short class, but it's really important you get as much as you possibly can in this short online session. In class, the biggest difference is the length of the lectures, obviously. And a lot of the discussion takes place in person. Well, obviously, since we're in person, but a lot of it happens to do with fleshing out ideas. And so in this class, in the online version, a lot of these ideas are given to you in a very compact form or in a way that you can get pretty much the surface level gist of it, and then my hope is that you become aware of it and that your awareness increases your civic activity. And so that's a big part of the last week of this class and these last two lectures. And so I'd like you to understand what it means to be an activist and why we do activism. So the last two lectures are about hashtag activism, and then the last one is about activism itself and how you could become an activist. Hashtag activism differs from activism in the ways in which it's deployed. So the way that which activism is deployed is usually in physical spaces, which we'll talk about in the next one. It's done in many different ways. Hashtag activism, sometimes called collectivism, is the way of being an activist in digital spaces. Now there's a lot of critical commentary on hashtag activism for obvious reasons. Some people even call it armchair activism, which is the idea that you could potentially share something and feel like you've made a difference, but you actually haven't done much except for share something online. And so the civic activity of that is a little different. When I make you do vlogs, I'm actually asking you to do something that is part of your civic voice, how to grow that expressive zone in digital spaces, which is a bit different than hashtag activism. Man, my beard is kind of nuts. It's going a little out of control. I promised myself I wasn't gonna cut it until I graduate from grad school. When I'm in my PhD right now, so I have to do my dissertation, which is due in a year, so we'll see how big that gets. Anyway, history of the hashtag. The hashtag is just a little over 10 years old. About a month ago, it celebrated its 10th year anniversary, the hashtag, which is the pound symbol. And that symbol was used on phones, and it's also the hash mark. And what Twitter did is they were using it in a way of organizing code on the back end. It's known as an anchor in code. And so they were using that as a way of finding their way around the different marks. This guy, Chris Messina, figured out that a hashtag existed because he made the hash mark and wrote the word barcamp after it, and it lit up. And in lighting up, he realized he could organize all of his tweets, much like the coders did, in a way that he was able to find out all the information backwards. So he was creating his own archive from it. And so in that, he created the hashtag, which became basically a way of just clicking on something and it becomes thematic. Soon after, something known as trends appeared on Twitter. And those trends appeared in ways that you could go and find the most used hashtags all at once. Then everything changed in 2010 and 2011. And so in the late 2010, a young man named Mohamed Bouazizi immolated himself in Tunisia, in a very small town in southern Tunisia. And he did so because he was protesting the government. That morning, he's a fruit seller, and that morning he went outside and his scale was stolen. He was told to buy it back. He basically had to offer a bribe in order to get it back. And rather than get it back, he immolated himself. He burned himself alive. A few days later, the news had sprung its way all the way to the northern, to the biggest city known as Tunis, where there's a multicultural society. And on Facebook, they were able to notice that hashtags had been employed at that point too. And both hashtags were employed in both Twitter and Facebook, and thus began the Arab Spring. 6 months from that time that Mohamed Bouazizi immolated himself, 3 governments had toppled, mainly due to the fact that the internet, or hashtag activism, had implored enough people to make this movement happen and caused the governments to actually become accountable for all the things that they had done. And so this is a big shift in the way that we understood how media itself interacts. Now you can interact via the digital space. You could create a hashtag and have enough people get on board with this idea to spread awareness and then hopefully activate them to cause some sort of change. This was followed by the idea of how they occupied Tahrir Square in Egypt during the Arab Spring, in a different activism, not of Tunis. And in that time, that idea of occupation had just become a new thing. So they occupied Tahrir Square. Thus began the Occupy movement. And the Occupy movement began in Tahrir Square in Egypt in January 25th of 2011. And in July of 2011, the magazine Adbusters from Canada actually implored people to arrive down at Wall Street to occupy it. And so they created the hashtag Occupy Wall Street movement. So what we'll learn about later is how movements don't always cohere properly when you don't have one significant idea. One of the biggest problems with Occupy Wall Street is that everybody came to the movement with different ideas of what they wanted. I visited Occupy Wall Street 5 days after it began, and I went down there and I asked 5 different people what they were there for, protesting, and I got 5 different answers. Now that's the thing about progress. Progress has many ideas, where the opposite, where going backward, only usually has one idea, which is nostalgia or retro ideas. And so that's a lot easier to buy into something that is non-progress and something that is progress, because progress is so wide. So how to be an activist is usually a very progressive stance and requires one coherent idea. And this is where the hashtag often becomes a very strong method of coherent ideas. Because without the hashtag, you have a lot of disparate themes. And so you always need somebody who's going to be able to sponsor the movement from one, perhaps one slogan type of idea. Now, critically, there's some things against this. Evgeny Morozov, the internet scholar, had written a book that basically said the revolution will not be done through Twitter. And a lot of people went against him and said, that's not fair because the Arab Spring happened via social media. And he said, it's not as much as you think. People still connect via physical spaces, and that the internet itself, while being a good place, often leads to hashtag or armchair activism rather than the activism itself. And so we saw that only a year later in Kony 2012, the video you guys watched for the class, which you'll be watching. And you'll notice that in Kony 2012, that the movement itself didn't do what I think it was supposed to do. And so Jason Russell's idea was really good and sponsored on the idea that you could change the world based on the internet. But at the same time, if you don't have a clear and present outcome of the goal in mind, now he did, which was to catch Kony. So in the United States, you might be implored to share the information about Kony. But when you get to Africa, when people aren't even connected or have the ability to even see the hashtag, does the activism actually equal the same thing? So this caused this disparate debate, which you'll be discussing in the discussion board about this, is how effective is it and why do certain hashtags win and some don't? Now, for example, and the one I'm going to talk about specifically today are two of them that I'm going to be speaking about today are about structural inequality. And I think that's one of the most important things we could recognize. And so two of the biggest hashtag movements of the last, I'd say 2 years, is the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter. And these movements are really important because you have to understand these are hashtag movements that have actually made changes in real life. And these changes in real life had become coherent in a hashtag space or a digital space, but also as physical spaces. So structural inequality is what they are going against. In the case of Black Lives Matter, you have to understand that Black Lives Matter is different than All Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter. And of course, the redundancy there is the same, which is, of course, lives matter. Literally everyone's life matters. That's one of the most important things we have to recognize. But the reason why Black Lives Matter, and the reason why we use that type of hashtag activism, due to structural inequality, there's a disproportionate number of Black people or people of color that are treated much more poorly than people who are white or more privileged. And as a movement, it's important because what it does is it brings light to the idea of Black Lives Mattering. Structural inequality shows up in many ways. When we see stories like Eric Garner's death or Trayvon Martin's death, oftentimes those deaths are more poignant because they stand out as ways that structural inequality has perpetuated the idea of violence against Black people or people of color, whereas it wouldn't be in the other way around. And so that movement, Black Lives Matter, is important because it is to point out or to recognize the structural inequality that's built into the system of segregation and race problems and issues that are perpetuated through mass media all the way down to the economy. And these are things that are part of the structure of the United States. So without the hashtag movement, sometimes people may not even be aware of it. And so the other movement I want to talk about is the Me Too movement. We have the Me Too movement that really started from the catalyst of the Weinstein story. Harvey Weinstein is a media mogul millionaire who mistreated women forever. But women were often never believed for the stories they were telling about him. And that's because women in media, and women in general, are often not believed as much as men, and are often put in a situation where structurally they are in different situations than men would ever be. The structural inequality of women is still very prevalent. Today's current wage gap is women make 80 cents to every man's dollar, and that stands for white women. If you move through different races, you'll find the wage gap is actually even larger. And the structural inequality allows men to dominate the field by accident. By just the ability to be there, oftentimes men are privileged into having the job before someone else or being prioritized in interviews. And this is something that is proven with statistics. So this isn't something that I just come up with as an activist stance, but this is through just the understanding of what people find out. So in the Me Too movement, there was finally the idea that someone was to be believed for being sexually abused by a very rich man who would often have so much money or so much ability to deny that he would discredit women as much as possible. And he wasn't alone. I think you hear these stories from Bill Cosby and Matt Lauer, and mostly these celebrities that we would get away with almost anything. So the Me Too movement, hashtag Me Too, was the idea that women could then say, Me Too. And in doing so, there's power in numbers. So what the hashtag did, and what makes it a very important movement that exists more digitally than it exists physically, is that it allows women to stand in unison, the stronger together. There's a big difference between the way that men and women grow up. When men go through puberty, and men often joke about it and make puberty like this joke throughout their teenage years. But at that same time, parents don't often explain to young men what it's like for a woman to go through puberty at that time too. Masculinity itself becomes a problem because men aren't often told about the different ways in which they can express themselves, especially through a very emotional period. At that same time, girls don't just go to women. Oftentimes girls go to sexual object. They are seen differently in a public sphere than the way that boys are. That structural inequality doesn't go away. That perpetuates itself into the workplace and often perpetuates itself into very big spheres. And in those big spheres, if there's no accountability, women are often ignored. And so the Me Too movement becomes this very forward progress idea of making sure that men are held accountable, or even women are held accountable, and even men can be part of this, as we saw with Terry Crews. That this idea is that you can understand that you are safer in a group, and this Me Too movement allows for a group of people to get together and establish themselves as somebody who's valued and trustworthy. Now, of course, as with all movements, these movements can go too far and become too wired up and then pop. What I haven't seen yet with Me Too is it popping, but I have seen expressing itself a little too far into different areas, and this is where you hear some of the backlash criticism of it. But that doesn't change the fact that the movement itself is very strong, and it is something that's very necessary for the field. So for women who were abused and were told that they weren't, now it allows the conversation to happen to say, you know, you shouldn't be abused. It isn't even about, being able to be heard that you were abused. It's the idea that maybe we have to have a conversation about what that is. What is sexual abuse? Where is sexual abuse? And when is sexual abuse? And so these types of conversations are sponsored from a digital space. The digital space allows us to cohere conversations and then express them. So for this response, I want you to go and locate another hashtag movement, one of many, and tell a little bit, very short. You don't have to go into detail, but basically find a hashtag movement and see if it was successful or non-successful and why. And then in the second part of the discussion, I really want you to talk about, do you believe that hashtag activism is a valuable activism that could be beneficial to the future? Or do you think it's really a waste of time and it really lessens people's ability to make change? Do you think it's more of an armchair activism that you feel better because you've shared it, but it really didn't change much at all? So these are the two things I want you to debate inside of the discussion board. And that's basically it. But I do think you should recognize that these movements are really, really important. And the movements are so important that it changes the way that we have discussions, that we change our conversation. And no conversation just flicks the switch and all of a sudden we become better people or we become a better society. No, this takes years, sometimes decades, sometimes even longer. But the conversation has to start somewhere.